Some nights, loneliness feels like a living thing that sits beside you at the dinner table. Ellyn knew this feeling well. At 57, she had spent years learning to fill the silence left by a husband's grave, and children she never had. The widowed healer lived quietly in her stone cottage deep in the ancient woods, tending to the village's sick and brewing remedies by candlelight. She had made peace with her simple life. But during a fierce winter storm, a pale woman collapsed at her door. The stranger was wounded, unconscious, and cold in a way that had nothing to do with the snow. Ellyn brought her inside without question. By morning, the storm had passed, but 200 dark figures stood in the white drifts around her cottage. Their eyes reflected the dawn like black mirrors. Something stirred in Ellyn's memory, fragments of a past she had buried long ago. What ancient secret would determine whether she lived to see another sunset? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver pendant at Ellyn's throat caught the firelight as she moved through her cottage, its surface worn smooth by decades of her fingers, finding it in moments of uncertainty. Her late husband Thomas had given it to her on their wedding day, claiming it had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who possessed what he called the gift of healing hands. At the time, Ellyn had thought it merely a romantic notion. Now, 30 years later, she wondered if there had been more truth in those words than either of them understood. The cottage sat in a clearing carved from the heart of Elderwood Forest, where trees older than memory stretched their gnarled branches toward a sky that seemed perpetually caught between seasons. Thomas had built their home here with his own hands, laying each stone with the careful precision of a man who understood that some foundations must last forever. The walls were thick granite, quarried from the mountains beyond the forest, and the windows were deep-set and narrow, practical choices for a harsh climate, though Ellyn sometimes wondered if Thomas had other reasons for wanting walls that could withstand more than weather. Her workroom occupied the cottage's eastern wing, where morning light streamed through tall windows onto shelves lined with glass jars and ceramic pots. Dried herbs hung in careful bundles from the rafters, feverfew for headaches, willow bark for pain, chamomile for troubled sleep. The air held the mingled scents of lavender, mint, and something deeper, earthier, that seemed to emanate from the leather-bound grimoire resting on her work table. The book had been Thomas's final gift to her, presented on his deathbed with trembling hands and eyes that held secrets he would never share. "Your real education begins now," he had whispered, his voice barely audible above the winter, wind rattling the windows. "Everything you need to know is in there, but you must learn to see beyond the words." Ellyn had spent the years since his death learning to read between the lines of what appeared to be a simple collection of herbal remedies. The recipes were there, certainly, detailed instructions for tinctures and salves that had proven remarkably effective in treating the village's ailments. But there were other things, too. Symbols drawn in the margins, notations in a script she couldn't identify, and formulas that seemed to require ingredients that didn't exist in any garden she knew. The villagers of Millhaven had come to depend on her skills in the decade since Thomas's passing. They arrived at her door with their fevers and fractures, their colicky babies and arthritic joints, trusting in her gentle hands and her seemingly inexhaustible knowledge of natural remedies. What they didn't know, what Ellyn herself was only beginning to suspect, was that her success came from more than book learning and careful technique. There was young Henrik, the blacksmith's son, whose broken arm had healed in half the expected time after she'd set it. Old Martha from the bakery, whose chronic cough had vanished overnight after a single dose of Ellyn's special tea. The merchant's daughter, born blue and breathless, who had taken her first healthy breath when Ellyn placed her hands on the tiny chest and whispered words she didn't remember learning. Each success had left Ellyn with the same strange sensation, a warmth that seemed to flow from somewhere deep within her, traveling down her arms and out through her fingertips. Thomas had called it the healer's touch, but Ellyn suspected it was something rarer, something that the village's practical-minded residents wouldn't understand or accept. The forest surrounding her cottage held its own mysteries. Elderwood was old beyond reckoning, its depths unexplored by all but the most foolhardy travelers. Local legends spoke of creatures that moved through its shadows, things that were neither fully animal nor entirely natural. Most villagers avoided the forest after dark, crossing themselves when they spoke of the strange lights that sometimes danced between the trees, or the voices that echoed through the mist on certain nights. Ellyn felt differently about the forest. In the years since Thomas's death, she had developed an unusual relationship with the wilderness that pressed against her doorstep. She often walked its paths in the early morning, gathering herbs that grew wild in hidden clearings, and she had never felt afraid. If anything, the forest seemed to welcome her presence, its ancient trees bending their branches to shelter her from rain, and its creatures watching her with what felt like benevolent curiosity. The cottage itself had grown around her life as a widow, each room adapted to solitary existence. The kitchen, once designed for family meals, now served primarily as an extension of her workroom, its sturdy table scarred by years of chopping herbs and grinding roots. The parlour, where she and Thomas had once entertained the occasional visitor, had become her private sanctuary, lined with books and furnished with a single comfortable chair positioned perfectly to catch the evening light. Her bedroom remained much as it had been during her marriage, though she had long since moved to sleep on what had once been Thomas's side of the bed. His clothes still hung in the wardrobe, and his shaving brush still sat on the washstand, gathering dust but somehow comforting in their familiar presence. She knew the village women thought it unhealthy, this preservation of her husband's memory. But Ellyn found strength in the continuity, in the sense that some things could remain unchanged even as the world shifted around them. The pale woman who had collapsed at her door challenged that sense of continuity in ways Ellyn was only beginning to comprehend. She had carried the stranger into the cottage without hesitation, guided by the same instincts that had made her a healer. But as she cleaned the blood from the woman's wounds, she had noticed things that defied explanation. The stranger's skin was impossibly pale, with a translucent quality that seemed to glow in the firelight. Her hair, black as a moonless night, fell in waves around a face that would have been beautiful if not for the sharp angles of her features and the unnatural stillness of her breathing. Most disturbing were her wounds, deep gashes that should have been mortal, but showed signs of healing even as Ellyn watched. When she had tried to check the woman's pulse, she had found none. No heartbeat, no breath, no sign of the basic functions that sustained life. Yet the stranger was undeniably alive, her body warm to the touch and her muscles occasionally twitching as if she fought battles in her dreams. Ellyn had seen death many times in her work as a healer. She knew its signs, its smell, its inexorable presence. This was something else, entirely. Something that existed in the space between life and death, neither fully claimed by one nor the other. As dawn approached and the storm outside began to subside, Ellyn found herself sitting beside the stranger's bed, studying the woman's face in the growing light. There was something familiar about her features, though Ellyn was certain they had never met. It was as if she recognized something deeper than physical appearance, some quality of spirit or essence that resonated with memories she couldn't quite grasp. The silver pendant at her throat had grown warm during the long night, warming against her skin in a way it hadn't since Thomas's death. When she touched it absently, images flashed through her mind, brief, disjointed scenes that felt like memories, though she was certain she had never experienced them. A great hall lit by candlelight, figures in dark robes gathered around an ancient altar. A woman, with eyes like stars, speaking words in a language that predated history. Outside, the first pale rays of sunrise began to penetrate the forest canopy, casting long shadows across the snow-covered clearing. Ellyn rose from her chair and moved to the window, drawn by an inexplicable sense that something momentous was about to occur. What she saw there would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet life, her healing gifts, and the true nature of the world that existed just beyond the edge of human understanding. The forest, which had been empty and peaceful when she last looked, now held figures, dozens of them, standing motionless among the trees like sentinels carved from shadow and ice. They made no move toward the cottage, offered no threat that she could identify, but their presence filled her with a mixture of fear and recognition that she couldn't explain. Somehow, she understood that her life as a simple village healer had come to an end, and that whatever lay ahead would demand courage she wasn't sure she possessed. The stranger stirred behind her, and Ellyn turned to see eyes like liquid starlight opening for the first time since the woman had collapsed at her door. When their gazes met, Ellyn felt a jolt of connection that seemed to echo through every cell of her body, awakening something that had been sleeping within her for longer than she could remember. "Thank you," the stranger whispered, her voice carrying an accent that seemed to belong to no earthly nation. "But I fear my presence here has put you in grave danger." As if summoned by her words, a sound rose from the forest, a low, harmonious note that seemed to come from every direction at once. It was not quite music and not quite speech, but something that bypassed the air and spoke directly to the soul. Ellyn's pendant grew hotter against her skin, and she realized with crystal clarity that her old life had ended the moment she opened her door to the storm. The real question was whether she would have the strength to face whatever was beginning. The harmonious note that had risen from the forest gradually faded, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with expectation. Ellyn stood at her window, watching the motionless figures among the trees, while behind her, the stranger, Seraphina, she had said her name was, struggled to sit up despite her obvious weakness. "You must listen carefully," Seraphina said, her voice gaining strength with each word. "Those who stand in your forest are not your enemies, but neither are they entirely safe. They are my people, and they have come for me." Ellyn turned from the window, studying the woman who had transformed her peaceful morning into something from a dark fairy tale. In the growing daylight, Seraphina's otherworldly nature was even more apparent. Her skin held a luminous quality that had nothing to do with health, and her eyes, those strange, starlit eyes, seemed to hold depths that spoke of centuries rather than decades. "Your people," Ellyn repeated slowly. "And what exactly are your people?" Seraphina's laugh held no humor. "We are what your kind calls vampire, though that word carries assumptions that are not entirely accurate." She gestured toward the obsidian chalice that sat on the bedside table, where Ellyn had placed it after finding it clutched in the stranger's hands. The cup was carved from black volcanic glass and inlaid with silver symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly. "I am what they call an alpha, a leader, a queen, if you will, responsible for the lives and actions of my clan." The words should have terrified Ellyn. Everything she had learned about vampires from village tales and ancient legends suggested creatures of mindless hunger and supernatural malevolence. Yet as she looked at Seraphina, she felt no fear, only a strange sense of recognition, as if she were finally meeting someone she had been expecting her entire life. "The chalice," Ellyn said, nodding toward the artifact. "It's important to you. It is the symbol of my authority and the vessel of my responsibility," Seraphina explained. "For 300 years I have carried it, and it has carried the weight of decisions that affect every member of my clan. Blood has been drunk from it in ceremonies of bonding, and blood has been spilled in its defense. It is both my greatest treasure and my heaviest burden." A sound from outside drew their attention, the soft crunch of footsteps in snow, approaching with deliberate caution. Ellyn moved to the window and saw 3 figures emerging from the tree line, walking slowly toward her cottage. Unlike the others who remained hidden in the shadows, these 3 moved with obvious purpose, their dark clothing stark against the white landscape. "My lieutenants," Seraphina said, though she made no move to rise from the bed. "They come to negotiate my return. And if I refuse to let you go, then they will take me by force, and your village will pay the price for harboring me." Seraphina's expression grew grave. "You do not understand the danger you have placed yourself in by helping me. There are others who hunt my kind, and those who aid us. They will not show you the mercy my people might." Before Ellyn could respond, a knock came at her door, 3 measured raps that seemed to echo through the cottage with unusual resonance. She glanced at Seraphina, who nodded almost imperceptibly, then walked slowly to the entrance. Her hand hesitated on the latch for a moment before she pulled the door open. The 3 figures standing on her threshold were clearly not human, though their appearance was far from the monstrous creatures of legend. The leader was tall and elegant, with silver hair that caught the morning light and eyes the color of winter ice. Flanking him were 2 others, a woman with copper hair and angular features, and a younger-looking man whose dark clothing seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. "Healer," the silver-haired leader said, his voice carrying a formality that suggested ancient customs and careful diplomacy. "I am Cassius, First Lieutenant to Alpha Seraphina of the Northern Clans. We come seeking the return of our leader." Ellyn found her voice, though it sounded strange to her own ears. "She is wounded and weak. Moving her now could—" "Could what?" the copper-haired woman interrupted, her tone sharp with impatience. "She is immortal, healer. Your mortal concerns about her physical welfare are misplaced." "Enough, Lydia," Cassius said quietly, and the woman stepped back with obvious reluctance. "The healer shows appropriate concern for her patient. We are grateful for the care you have provided, and we offer no threat to you or your village. We seek only the safe return of our Alpha." "I'm afraid that's not entirely accurate," Seraphina's voice came from behind Ellyn, and they all turned to see her standing in the doorway to the bedroom. She leaned heavily against the frame, but her bearing remained regal despite her obvious weakness. "The situation is more complex than a simple retrieval mission." Cassius's expression shifted from diplomatic neutrality to genuine concern. "My lady, you should not be standing. Your injuries will heal, given time," Seraphina finished. "But time is a luxury we may not possess. How many of our enemies follow our trail?" The dark-clad younger man spoke for the first time, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Shadowmere pack tracks us still, my lady. They are perhaps 6 hours behind, maybe less. And there are others, creatures that serve the old enemies, things that hunt by scent and starlight. Ellyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air streaming through her open door. Enemies? What enemies? Those who believe vampire and human cannot coexist, Serafina explained, moving carefully to a chair near the fireplace. Those who would see both our kinds diminished rather than allow us to find common ground. My clan has worked for decades to build bridges between our worlds, to prove that cooperation is possible. This has made us targets for those who profit from conflict and fear. The healer has shown us kindness, Cassius observed, his gaze moving between Ellyn and Serafina with obvious calculation. Perhaps she could be convinced to provide shelter for a few more hours, until you regain sufficient strength to travel. I cannot ask that of her, Serafina said firmly. She has already risked too much by taking me in. When our enemies arrive, they will show no mercy to those who have aided us. Ellyn listened to this exchange with growing amazement. Everything about the situation defied her understanding of the world, yet something deep within her responded to the discussion as if she had been preparing for this moment her entire life. The silver pendant at her throat had grown warm again, and with its warmth came flashes of memory, or perhaps vision, that showed scenes of ancient alliances and terrible conflicts. What if I choose to help? She heard herself saying. What if I want to provide that shelter? The four vampires looked at her with expressions ranging from surprise to alarm. It was Lydia who spoke first, her voice sharp with disbelief. You are mortal, healer. You cannot comprehend the forces that would be arrayed against you. This is not your war. Perhaps not, Ellyn replied, though she wasn't entirely certain why she felt compelled to argue. But it's my cottage, my choice, and my conscience that I'll have to live with afterward. Serafina studied her with those impossible starlit eyes, and Ellyn felt as if the vampire queen were reading something written in her soul. There is more to you than appears on the surface, healer. Your cottage sits on old ground, and you yourself carry the scent of ancient bloodlines. Tell me, what do you know of your ancestry? Very little, Ellyn admitted. My parents died when I was young, and my husband rarely spoke of family history. I know only that I seem to have a gift for healing. A gift, Cassius repeated thoughtfully. Yes, I sense that as well. There is power in you, dormant perhaps, but unmistakable to those who know how to look. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation, coming fast through the forest from the direction of the village. Cassius and his companions tensed immediately, their bodies shifting into defensive postures with fluid grace. Through the window, Ellyn could see a rider approaching, young Henrik from the blacksmith's forge, his horse lathered with sweat despite the cold. "Healer Ellyn," he called as he dismounted in her yard. "You must come quickly. Strange folk have arrived in the village, asking questions about strangers in the forest. The mayor sent me to warn you. They carry weapons of silver and iron, and they speak of hunting monsters." The implications of his words settled over the cottage like a shroud. Serafina's enemies had arrived far sooner than expected, and Ellyn found herself at the center of a conflict she was only beginning to understand. As she looked around at the faces surrounding her, vampire and human alike, she realized that the quiet life she had built for herself was about to be tested in ways she had never imagined. The choice before her was simple in its starkness: abandon Serafina to her fate and hope to return to her peaceful existence, or step fully into a world of supernatural politics and ancient grudges. Her hand moved unconsciously to her silver pendant, and as her fingers touched its warm surface, she felt a certainty that surprised her with its strength. She had already made her choice the moment she opened her door to the storm. Henrik's warning hung in the air like morning frost, sharp and undeniable. Ellyn watched the young blacksmith's son shift nervously from foot to foot, his eyes darting between her face and the obvious strangers who had emerged from her cottage. She could see him struggling to process what he was witnessing, the pale, elegant figures who moved with inhuman grace, the tension that crackled between them like lightning before a storm. "How many?" Cassius asked, his voice cutting through the moment with military precision. "Sir?" Henrik stammered, clearly uncertain whether he should be addressing the silver-haired stranger at all. "How many hunters came to your village?" Ellyn clarified, stepping forward to bridge the gap between mortal and immortal concerns. "What did they look like? How were they armed?" Henrik's relief at hearing a familiar voice was palpable. "6 of them, healer Ellyn. Hard men, with scars and weapons like I've never seen. Their leader wore a coat of black leather covered in silver studs, and he carried a sword that seemed to drink in the light. They asked the mayor about strangers in the forest, about anyone who might be harboring creatures of the night. Lydia, the copper-haired vampire, made a sound of disgust. Shadowmere hunters. They announce themselves with their crude display of silver and their ridiculous theatrical costumes, as if intimidation could substitute for actual skill. Do not underestimate them, Seraphina warned, though she remained seated by the fire. Their theatrics may be crude, but their weapons are not. They have killed many of our kind over the centuries." Cassius was already moving, his attention focused on the practical aspects of their situation. He reached into his coat and withdrew what appeared to be a simple silver ring, its surface etched with symbols that seemed to shift when viewed directly. As he slipped it onto his finger, the ring began to emit a faint, pulsing light. "What is that?" Ellyn asked, fascinated despite the danger. "A moonstone communication ring," the young dark-clad vampire explained. "It allows us to speak with our clan across great distances. We use them to coordinate movements, share intelligence, and call for aid when necessary." Cassius closed his eyes, his lips moving in what appeared to be silent speech. After a moment, the ring's light intensified, and Ellyn could have sworn she heard the faint echo of voices carried on a wind that touched no earthly air. "The clan is moving to defensive positions," he reported after the light faded. "But they cannot reach us before the hunters do. We must prepare for a siege." "No," Seraphina said firmly. "I will not allow innocent villagers to suffer for my presence here. We retreat deeper into the forest, draw the hunters away from populated areas." "My lady, you are in no condition to travel through the wilderness while being pursued," Cassius protested. "Your injuries will have to suffice," Seraphina finished. "I am Alpha for a reason, Cassius. I have survived worse than this." Ellyn found herself speaking before she had consciously decided to intervene. What if there were another option? What if we could make the cottage defensible instead of abandoning it? All eyes turned to her, and she felt the weight of their attention like a physical force. Henrik stepped closer, his face pale with growing understanding of just how far beyond normal village problems this situation had strayed. "Healer," Cassius said carefully, "I appreciate your willingness to help, but this cottage, sturdy as it may be, cannot withstand the kind of assault these hunters will bring. They carry weapons blessed by ancient rituals, tools specifically designed to breach supernatural defenses." "But what if the cottage has defenses you don't know about?" Ellyn asked, her hand moving instinctively to the silver pendant at her throat. "What if there's more to this place than simple stone walls?" Seraphina leaned forward, her starlit eyes focusing intently on Ellyn's face. "Explain." Ellyn hesitated, uncertain how to put her growing suspicions into words. "Since you arrived, I've been having strange experiences, dreams or maybe memories of things I've never lived through. And this pendant, it was my husband's gift, but I think it may have belonged to his family for much longer than he told me. It's been growing warm, almost hot, since you came here. May I see it? Serafina asked gently. Ellyn lifted the pendant from around her neck and placed it in Serafina's pale hands. The moment the vampire's fingers touched the silver, the cottage seemed to shiver, not physically, but in some deeper way that Ellyn felt in her bones. The pendant blazed with sudden light, and the silver symbols etched into its surface became clearly visible for the first time. "This is no simple piece of jewelry," Serafina breathed, her voice filled with wonder. "This is a hereditary talisman, crafted by the old bloodlines, when vampire and human mages worked together. It marks you as a descendant of the healing houses, the mortal families who served as bridges between our worlds in the ancient days." Henrik made a sound that might have been a whimper, but Ellyn barely noticed. The pendant's light was spreading, revealing markings carved into the cottage's stone walls that had been invisible moments before. Runes and protective symbols covered every surface, creating an intricate network of magical defenses that had been waiting centuries for the proper key to activate them. "Your husband knew," Lydia said, her tone respectful for the first time since her arrival. "He built this cottage on a convergence of ley lines and used the old ways to ward it. But the protections required a blood heir to activate them." "A blood heir," Ellyn repeated slowly. "You mean me." "The healing gift runs in your family line," Cassius explained. "But it's more than simple medical knowledge. Your ancestors were magical practitioners, bridge builders between our kinds. The cottage, your pendant, even your location in the heart of the forest. It's all part of a larger design." The sound of approaching horses cut through their revelation, coming fast through the forest from multiple directions. Henrik grabbed Ellyn's arm, his face white with terror. "They're coming! The hunters! They must have found the trail!" "How long do we have?" Serafina asked, struggling to her feet despite her weakness. Cassius's ring flared to life again, and this time Ellyn could clearly hear voices speaking in urgent, clipped tones. "Our perimeter watchers report 6 mounted hunters approaching from the village path, and at least a dozen foot soldiers moving through the forest from the east, perhaps 10 minutes before they reach the clearing." "Then we activate the defenses now," Ellyn said, surprised by the certainty in her own voice. "Whatever my ancestors built into this place, we use it." Serafina studied her face with those impossible eyes. "The activation requires more than touching the pendant, Ellyn. It requires a conscious choice to accept your heritage, to take responsibility for powers you may not understand or be able to control. Once awakened, your magical abilities cannot be hidden again. You would become a target for the same forces that hunt us." Henrik was backing toward the door, clearly torn between loyalty to his village healer and terror at the supernatural forces gathering around them. "Healer Ellyn, maybe you should listen to them. Maybe we should just run." "Where would we run to?" Ellyn asked, though her tone held no reproach. "Henrik, these people came to my door seeking help. I cannot turn them away any more than I could turn away a sick child or an injured farmer. It isn't in my nature." She took the pendant from Serafina's hands and slipped it back around her neck. The moment it touched her skin, warmth flooded through her body, followed by a sensation she could only describe as awakening. It was as if she had been living her entire life with only half her senses, and now the world revealed itself in its full, complex glory. She could feel the ley lines beneath the cottage like rivers of power, could sense the protective wards woven into every stone. More than that, she could feel the hunters approaching, their hostile intentions broadcasting like heat from a forge, their silver weapons leaving scars on the magical fabric of the forest. "I accept," she said quietly, and the cottage began to glow. The cottage's glow intensified as Ellyn spoke her acceptance, and she felt power coursing through her veins like liquid starlight. The walls hummed with ancient energy, and the protective runes carved into the stone blazed to life with silver fire. Henrik stumbled backward, his eyes wide with wonder and terror, while the vampires watched with expressions of profound respect. From somewhere deep within the cottage's foundation came a resonant chime, as if a great bell had been struck in the depths of the earth. The sound seemed to awaken something that had been sleeping for decades, and Ellyn suddenly understood that her husband's death had not been the end of her story. It had been preparation for its true beginning. "Remarkable," Serafina breathed, her weakness temporarily forgotten, as she watched the transformation taking place around them. "The defenses are more sophisticated than anything I've encountered in 3 centuries. Your ancestors were master craftsmen of magical architecture." Cassius was already moving toward the windows, his trained eye assessing their new tactical situation. "The wards will hold against conventional weapons, but the hunters carry more than silver blades. They have tools blessed by the old enemies, artifacts designed specifically to breach supernatural defenses." "Then we must be ready for them," Ellyn said, and was surprised to find her voice steady and calm. The panic she had expected to feel was absent, replaced by a crystalline clarity that allowed her to see their situation with tactical precision. "How long will the initial barriers hold?" "Against 6 hunters? Perhaps an hour if they probe cautiously, less if they commit to a full assault," Lydia replied. "But there is something else to consider. The activation of defenses this powerful will draw attention from more than just the immediate threat. Every supernatural entity within 50 miles will sense what has happened here." As if summoned by her words, a new presence made itself known in the cottage's main room. The air shimmered like heat haze, and from nothingness stepped a figure that made even the vampires tense with wariness. It was a woman, tall and elegant, with hair like spun moonbeams, and eyes that held the depths of ancient seas. She wore robes that seemed to be cut from the fabric of twilight itself, and in her hands she carried a crystalline shard that pulsed with inner light. "Hello, granddaughter," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate in dimensions beyond the physical. "I have been waiting a very long time for you to claim your birthright." Henrik made a sound that was half gasp, half prayer, and collapsed into the nearest chair. Ellyn stared at the apparition, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing, even as her newly awakened magical senses confirmed the impossible truth. "You're dead," she said simply. "My grandmother died before I was born." "Death is a relative concept for those who master the deeper magics," the spirit replied with a gentle smile. "I am Morwen, of the healing house of Silverbrook, and I bound my essence to this place when I sensed that the old alliances would be needed again. The crystalline memory shard you see in my hands contains the accumulated wisdom of our family line, everything you need to understand what you have become." Serafina rose from her chair with obvious effort, her immortal nature allowing her to show proper respect even in her weakened state. "Lady Morwen, your reputation precedes you even into our archives. It is an honor to meet one of the legendary bridge builders." "The honor is mine, young Alpha," Morwen replied. "Your clan has proven itself worthy of the ancient pacts through centuries of honorable conduct. It gives me hope that the old alliances can be renewed for a new age." The memory shard in Morwen's hands flared with sudden brilliance, and images began to cascade through Ellyn's mind, scenes from a past she had never lived but somehow remembered with perfect clarity. She saw great halls where vampires and human mages worked side by side, their combined knowledge creating wonders that neither could achieve alone. She witnessed the terrible war that had shattered those alliances, driven by fear and misunderstanding on both sides. Most importantly, she saw her own role in the cosmic pattern that was unfolding. Her bloodline had been guardians and healers, bridge builders who could ease the ancient mistrust between mortal and immortal worlds. The gift that allowed her to heal human ailments could also mend the spiritual wounds that centuries of conflict had inflicted on both races. The hunters approach, Cassius reported from his position at the window. I can see their torches through the trees. They move with purpose, but without haste. They know we cannot flee. They are confident because they carry artifacts of binding, Morwen explained, her form beginning to fade as the magical energies of the cottage reorganized themselves around Ellyn's awakened power. Chains forged from star metal and blessed with the blood of fallen angels, capable of holding even our kind helpless. But they do not expect to face a practitioner of the old ways. Henrik found his voice, though it shook with strain. Healer Ellyn, what's happening? What are you becoming? Ellyn turned to him, and she could see her reflection in his wide eyes, still recognizably herself, but transformed by the power that now flowed through her. Her pendant blazed like a small sun against her chest, and her eyes held flecks of the same silver fire that danced along the cottage walls. I'm becoming who I was always meant to be, she said gently. But Henrik, you must choose now whether to stay or go. What happens next will be dangerous, and I cannot guarantee your safety. The young man looked around the cottage, at the glowing walls, the vampires preparing for battle, the fading spirit of Ellyn's grandmother, and straightened his shoulders with a courage that reminded her of his father. I've known you all my life, Healer Ellyn. You saved my arm when I was 7, delivered my sister when the midwife couldn't be found, and sat with my grandfather through his final fever. If you say these people deserve protection, then I'll help provide it. Seraphina smiled, the expression transforming her pale features. There is honor in him. Perhaps the old alliances can be rebuilt on foundations of individual courage rather than ancient treaties. The first test comes now, Lydia announced grimly. The hunters have reached the edge of the clearing. They carry torches and silver chains, and their leader bears a sword that reeks of old magic and older hatred. Through the window, Ellyn could see 6 figures emerging from the forest, their black clothing stark against the snow. They moved with the confidence of predators who had cornered their prey, unaware that the cottage they approached now pulsed with defenses that had been waiting decades for activation. The crystalline memory shard in Morwen's fading hands suddenly blazed with light, and knowledge flooded through Ellyn's mind. Tactical information, defensive spells, the weaknesses of the weapons arrayed against them. She understood now why her ancestors had built this place, why her husband had brought her here, why every event of her life had been preparation for this moment. Let them come, she said, and her voice carried harmonics that made the cottage walls ring like struck crystal. It's time they learned that some bridges are strong enough to bear any weight. The first arrow struck the cottage's outer barriers and burst into silver flames that illuminated the entire clearing. The siege had begun, and with it, Ellyn's transformation from village healer to something far more dangerous and wonderful. The silver flames from the hunter's arrow danced along the cottage's protective barriers like living things, casting eerie shadows through the windows. Ellyn watched their leader, a tall man whose black leather coat bore scars from 100 battles, raise what appeared to be a compass made from yellowed bone. The artifact's needle spun wildly for a moment before pointing directly at the cottage with unwavering certainty. A wraithbone compass, Seraphina identified grimly. It tracks magical emanations across vast distances. They've been following the traces of ancient power that surround you, Ellyn. Your awakening has made you visible to every supernatural hunter on the continent. The leader of the hunting party raised his voice, his words carrying across the clearing with preternatural clarity. Creatures of the night, you harbor in a place of old magic, but stone and spell cannot protect you forever. Surrender the vampire queen, and the mortal woman may yet live to see another dawn. Cassius moved to another window, his movements fluid despite the tension. 6 outside, as Henrik reported, but the wraithbone compass suggests they're not alone. That artifact can summon reinforcements from great distances, other hunters, bound creatures, things that serve the old enemies. Ellyn felt power flowing through her more strongly now, the cottage's defenses responding to her will like extensions of her own body. Through her enhanced senses, she could perceive the supernatural landscape around them with startling clarity. The forest teemed with life, both natural and otherwise, deer and wolves moving through the undergrowth, but also stranger things that watched the unfolding confrontation with ancient, intelligent eyes. "There," she said suddenly, pointing toward the eastern edge of the clearing. Something approaches through the trees. Not human, but not entirely animal either. Lydia's head snapped toward the direction Ellyn indicated, her vampire senses confirming what human perception had missed. Shadowhounds. The hunters have brought pets. Her voice carried a mixture of disgust and professional assessment. They're bound creatures, wolves twisted by dark magic into something that can track by scent across both physical and spiritual dimensions. Henrik gripped his blacksmith's hammer with white knuckles, the tool looking pitifully inadequate against the supernatural forces gathering outside. "How many are we facing?" "The immediate threat is manageable," Cassius replied, though his tone suggested the situation was far from ideal. 6 hunters, perhaps a dozen shadowhounds, and whatever other creatures they can summon with their artifacts. But they're testing our defenses methodically. This isn't a hasty assault. They're probing for weaknesses. As if to confirm his assessment, another arrow struck the cottage's barriers, this one from a different angle. The silver flames that erupted were brighter this time, and Ellyn felt a corresponding drain on the cottage's magical reserves. The defenses were strong, but not inexhaustible. They're mapping the ward structure, she realized, her grandmother's inherited knowledge providing understanding she hadn't possessed moments before. Each arrow carries different enchantments, designed to reveal different aspects of our protections. Give them enough data, and they'll find the weak points. Seraphina struggled to her feet again, her pale features set with determination. Then we don't give them time to complete their analysis. We take the fight to them. "My lady, you're in no condition," Cassius began. "I am Alpha," Seraphina cut him off. "I have led this clan through 3 centuries of warfare and diplomacy. I will not cower behind magical barriers while mortal allies risk their lives for my protection." The wraithbone compass in the lead hunter's hands suddenly flared with sickly light, and the needle began spinning in rapid circles. Ellyn felt a corresponding disturbance in the magical fabric surrounding the cottage. Something was being torn open, a doorway being forced through the barriers between worlds. "Summoning circle," Morwen's fading spirit warned, her voice barely audible now as her energy dispersed into the cottage's defensive matrix. "They're calling something through from the shadow realm. The compass serves as both tracker and key." The air in the center of the clearing began to ripple like water, and through the distortion stepped creatures that made the shadow hounds look like ordinary pets. They stood upright like men, but moved with the fluid grace of predators, their forms wreathed in darkness that seemed to devour light. Red eyes burned in skulls that appeared to be carved from obsidian, and their claws gleamed with the same silver radiance as the hunters' weapons. "Void stalkers," Lydia breathed, and for the first time since her arrival, Ellyn heard genuine fear in the vampire's voice. They're manifestations of pure negation, creatures that exist to unmake magical constructs. The cottage's defenses will hold, Ellyn said firmly, though she could feel the truth of the threat. The Void Stalkers were indeed antithetical to magical protections, their very presence causing the cottage's wards to fluctuate and weaken. But not indefinitely. We need another strategy. Henrik's voice shook as he spoke. In the forge, when we're working difficult metals, sometimes the direct approach doesn't work. Sometimes you have to find a different angle, apply pressure where the metal doesn't expect it. His words sparked an idea that seemed to come from both her own intuition and her grandmother's inherited wisdom. Ellyn moved to her workroom, where the ancient grimoire lay open on her table. The pages that had once shown simple herbal remedies now displayed complex magical formulae, the text shifting and changing as her understanding deepened. "The cottage isn't just defended," she said slowly, her finger tracing symbols that appeared to write themselves on the parchment. "It's connected. The ley lines don't just provide power, they create a network. If I can access that network..." "You could turn the entire forest into a defensive system," Serafina finished, understanding immediately. "Channel the natural magical energies of the region through the cottage's focal point. But the risk is that I might not be able to control that much power," Ellyn acknowledged, "or that using it will announce my presence to every supernatural entity within 100 miles. But what's the alternative? Let them breach our defenses and slaughter everyone inside." Another Void Stalker materialized in the clearing, its presence causing the cottage's protective glow to dim noticeably. The lead hunter raised his bone compass again, its needle now pointing steadily at different sections of the cottage's perimeter. They were almost finished mapping the ward structure. "There's something else," Cassius said quietly. "The ring. I'm receiving communications from the clan. Other hunter groups are mobilizing, drawn by the magical emanations from this location. We have perhaps an hour before we face a much larger force." Ellyn closed her eyes and placed her hands flat on the grimoire's open pages. She could feel the ley lines beneath the cottage like rivers of molten light, and beyond them, the vast network of natural magic that connected every living thing in the ancient forest. The power was there, waiting to be channeled, but accessing it would require her to open herself completely to forces she was only beginning to understand. "Henrik," she said, without opening her eyes, "if this goes wrong, if I lose control of what I'm about to attempt, you must get word to the village. Tell them to evacuate to the old stone church. It has its own protections, weaker than these but sufficient for purely human threats. Ellyn, promise me." "I promise." She drew a deep breath and began to speak words in a language she had never learned, but somehow knew, calling upon powers that had slept in the earth since the world was young. The cottage began to shake, not with external assault, but with the force of magical energies being drawn from every direction. The real battle was about to begin. The ancient words flowed from Ellyn's lips like liquid fire, each syllable causing the cottage to vibrate with harmonics that seemed to echo through dimensions beyond the physical. The ley lines beneath the foundation blazed to life, their energy coursing upward through the stone walls and outward into the forest itself. Trees that had stood for centuries began to glow with soft phosphorescence, their branches swaying despite the absence of wind. In her workroom, nestled among the herbs and remedies she had collected over the years, a new artifact began to manifest. What had once been a simple phoenix feather, a good luck charm Thomas had given her on their first anniversary, now blazed with inner fire that spoke of ancient bloodlines and protective magics. The phoenix feather talisman pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, its power awakening in response to the magical forces she was channeling. Extraordinary, Seraphina breathed, though the effort of standing was clearly taking its toll. I can feel the forest responding to your call. Every tree, every stone, every stream, they're all becoming part of the defensive network. Outside, the hunters had noticed the change immediately. The lead hunter lowered his wraithbone compass, its needle now spinning wildly as the magical emanations from the cottage overwhelmed its tracking abilities. The void stalkers that had been systematically weakening the cottage's defenses found themselves suddenly surrounded by a web of natural magic that extended in all directions. "Fall back," the hunter captain shouted to his men. "The witch has tapped into the old network. Standard tactics are useless now." But even as his human allies retreated, the void stalkers pressed forward with mechanical determination. Their nature as creatures of negation compelled them to seek out and destroy magical constructs, and the expanding network of forest defenses presented an irresistible target. They began tearing at the ley lines themselves, their claws leaving wounds in the magical fabric that caused entire sections of forest to dim and wither. Ellyn felt each attack like a physical blow. The phoenix feather talisman at her throat blazed brighter, its protective energies shielding her from the worst of the backlash. But she could sense the limits of what she was attempting. The power flowing through her was vast beyond her. Experience and controlling it required a level of magical discipline she was still developing. "The Void Stalkers are disrupting the network faster than I can maintain it," she said through gritted teeth. "If they sever enough connections, the feedback could destroy not just the cottage but half the forest." Cassius moved with sudden decision, his moonstone ring flaring to life as he contacted his clan. "All units, converge on our position immediately. Priority Alpha Defense Protocol." He turned to the others in the cottage. "Reinforcements are coming, but they're 20 minutes away at best. We need to buy time." "I can help with that," Henrik said quietly, and everyone turned to look at the young blacksmith with surprise. He was holding a piece of iron that Ellyn didn't recognize, a rod about the length of his forearm, carved with runes that seemed to shift and flow in the firelight. "This has been in my family's forge for generations. My grandfather said it was payment from a strange customer, someone who needed work done but paid with more than coin." Lydia's eyes widened as she recognized the artifact. "That's dwarven-forged cold iron, inscribed with binding runes. It's designed to anchor magical constructs, to prevent them from being disrupted or unmade." "How do we use it?" Ellyn asked, her concentration wavering as another void stalker tore through a particularly strong ley line connection. "Drive it into the ground at the center of your working," Henrik explained. "My grandfather showed me once, when strange lights were dancing in the forest, and the cattle wouldn't settle. He said the iron calls to the deep places in the earth, makes the magic hold steady against things that would tear it apart." Without hesitation, Henrik moved to the cottage's main room and knelt beside the fireplace. The hearth sat directly over the primary convergence point of the ley lines, where Thomas had positioned it with deliberate intent decades earlier. With strong, practiced strokes, Henrik drove the iron rod through the stone floor and deep into the earth beneath. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The chaotic fluctuations in the magical network suddenly stabilized, the dancing energies snapping into rigid patterns that the void stalkers found much more difficult to disrupt. The phoenix feather talisman around Ellyn's neck pulsed with renewed strength, its protective aura expanding to encompass the entire cottage. "Well done," Seraphina said, genuine admiration in her voice. "Your grandfather was clearly more than a simple blacksmith." "He never talked much about his past," Henrik replied, settling back on his heels. "But he always said that every family has secrets, and some secrets are meant to help when the world gets too dark." Through the windows, they could see the hunters regrouping at the edge of the clearing. The void stalkers continued their assault on the network, but their progress had slowed dramatically. More concerning was the activity around the Wraithbone compass. The lead hunter was performing some kind of ritual, speaking words in a harsh, guttural language, while his men arranged silver chains in complex geometric patterns. "Binding circle," Ellyn identified, her enhanced understanding allowing her to read the magical intent behind their actions. "They're preparing to trap us inside our own defenses, turn the protective network into a prison." "Can they do that?" Henrik asked. "If they complete the ritual, yes," Seraphina confirmed grimly. "The old enemies were masters of perversion, taking protective magic and twisting it into tools of imprisonment and torture. We cannot allow them to finish their working." Cassius's ring pulsed with incoming communication, and his expression grew grave as he received the update. "Clan forces report heavy resistance. Additional hunter groups are converging on the forest from 3 directions. Our reinforcements are being delayed." The magical energies flowing through Ellyn reached a crescendo, and she found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. The power was there to strike out at their enemies, to turn the forest itself into a weapon that could sweep away the hunters and their bound creatures. But doing so would require her to embrace aspects of magic that her grandmother's memories labeled as dangerous, forces that could corrupt as easily as they could protect. "There's another way," she said slowly, her voice carrying new harmonics as the phoenix feather talisman responded to her emotional state. "Instead of fighting them directly, what if we gave them what they think they want?" "Explain," Seraphina said sharply. "They came here hunting vampires, following the traces of your presence. What if we provided a different target? What if we made it appear that you had fled deeper into the forest, toward the old ruins near the mountain pass?" Lydia frowned. "A deception. But their Wraithbone compass will reveal the truth." "Not if we give it something else to track," Ellyn interrupted. "The grimoire contains formulas for creating magical decoys, phantom traces that can fool even the most sophisticated detection methods. Combined with the forest network I've established, we could create a false trail leading away from populated areas." "It would buy time," Cassius agreed thoughtfully, "and draw them away from the village. But such a deception requires enormous power to maintain, and if they discover the truth before our reinforcements arrive—" "Then we deal with that when it happens," Ellyn said firmly. "But I won't stand by and watch them turn my home into a trap or let innocent villagers suffer because I was too afraid to take risks." The phoenix feather talisman blazed with sudden brilliance, responding to her determination, and she began to weave the most complex, magical working of her life. The deception would have to be perfect, compelling enough to draw the hunters away, subtle enough to avoid immediate detection, and powerful enough to withstand the scrutiny of their artifacts. As she worked, she couldn't shake the feeling that this decision would set in motion events far beyond what any of them could anticipate. The magical deception Ellyn was weaving suddenly wavered as a new presence entered the clearing, not through the forest paths, but materializing directly from shadow, as if the darkness itself had taken human form. The figure that stepped into view made even Seraphina draw back in shock, her face draining of what little color it possessed. "Thomas," Ellyn whispered, her concentration shattered as she stared at the man she had mourned for 10 years. Her husband looked exactly as he had on the day he died, tall and broad-shouldered, with gentle brown eyes and hands that had built their cottage stone by stone. But there was something different about him now, something that her newly awakened magical senses could detect immediately. He radiated power that was both ancient and alien, and when he moved, shadows clung to his form like living things. "Hello, my love," Thomas said, his voice carrying the same warm tone she remembered from 1,000 quiet evenings by their fireplace. "I've missed you terribly." The hunters at the edge of the clearing had stopped their ritual, clearly as surprised by this development as anyone in the cottage. Their leader raised his wraithbone compass, but the needle spun wildly before pointing directly at Thomas with such force that cracks appeared in the bone itself. "That's impossible," Cassius breathed. "The readings! He's registering as both immortal and mortal simultaneously. What manner of creature is he?" Seraphina struggled to her feet, her star-lit eyes fixed on Thomas with a mixture of recognition and dread. "He's a guardian, one of the ancient bloodline, the original bridge builders between our worlds. They were thought to be extinct." Thomas smiled at her acknowledgement, but his attention remained focused on Ellyn. "I'm sorry, my dear one, for the deception. My death was necessary. There were forces hunting me, enemies who would have used you to get to me. I thought if I appeared to die, if I withdrew from the world, you would be safe." "Safe from what?" Ellyn demanded, though part of her already suspected the answer. Before Thomas could respond, a new artifact materialized in his hands, a dagger whose blade seemed to be forged from crystallized shadow. The Shadowheart dagger pulsed with malevolent energy, its edge sharp enough to cut through both flesh and spirit. When Thomas raised it, the void stalkers in the clearing suddenly turned away from their assault on the magical network and began moving toward the cottage with renewed purpose. "From me," Thomas said quietly. "From what I was created to do." The revelation hit Ellyn like a physical blow. Through her enhanced senses, she could now perceive the truth that had been hidden from her throughout their marriage. The cottage hadn't been built as a sanctuary. It had been constructed as a trap. The ley line convergence, the protective wards, even her own bloodline, everything had been arranged to create the perfect prison for supernatural entities. "You're working with them," she realized, her voice hollow with betrayal. "The hunters, the void stalkers. You've been planning this for decades." "Not working with them," Thomas corrected gently. "Using them. The hunters believe they're conducting a righteous purge of supernatural corruption. They have no idea that their leader has been manipulated from the beginning, that their weapons and tactics were designed not to destroy vampires, but to capture them." Henrik stepped protectively closer to Ellyn, his blacksmith's hammer raised despite its obvious inadequacy against the forces arrayed against them. "Why?" he demanded. "What could possibly be worth this kind of deception?" Thomas's expression grew distant, as if he were seeing across vast spans of time. "My kind were created as guardians, tasked with maintaining the balance between mortal and immortal worlds. But balance requires sacrifice, and sometimes those sacrifices must be significant." The lead hunter was approaching the cottage now, his silver chains glowing with eldritch light as he prepared to complete his binding ritual. But instead of targeting the cottage's defenses, he began arranging the chains in patterns that would trap everything within, vampire and human alike. "The ancient pact," Seraphina said, her voice filled with dawning horror. "It wasn't an alliance between our peoples. It was a contract of containment. Your guardians were meant to prevent supernatural wars by ensuring that neither side could ever gain decisive advantage. By eliminating powerful individuals on both sides, Thomas confirmed, alpha vampires, master mages, anyone whose abilities might tip the balance too far in either direction. Ellyn's bloodline wasn't chosen for its healing gifts. It was chosen for its ability to bind and contain supernatural entities. The phoenix feather talisman at Ellyn's throat suddenly blazed with defensive fire as Thomas raised the Shadowheart dagger. The blade cut through the air toward her, not to kill, but to mark, to brand her with symbols that would make her a living prison for any supernatural entity she touched. "You won't cage me," Seraphina snarled, her vampire nature finally overriding her weakened condition. She moved with inhuman speed, placing herself between Thomas and Ellyn despite her injuries. "Whatever your ancient purposes, I will not be made a prisoner by treachery." Thomas paused, his expression genuinely sad. "I take no pleasure in this, Alpha. Your clan has shown more honor than most of my own kind. But the balance must be maintained." It was Henrik who acted next, his young blacksmith's instincts recognizing the true nature of the threat. The dwarven iron rod he had driven into the cottage's foundation wasn't just an anchor for magical energies, it was a tool that could disrupt binding spells. With a strength born of desperation, he wrenched the rod from the stone floor and hurled it at Thomas like a spear. The iron struck the Shadowheart dagger just as Thomas brought it down, and both artifacts shattered in an explosion of conflicting energies. The backlash sent everyone in the cottage sprawling, while outside the binding circle collapsed, and the Void Stalkers suddenly found themselves without purpose or direction. In the chaos that followed, Ellyn felt the truth of her situation crystallize with painful clarity. Her husband's love had been real, but it had been love filtered through duty to a cause that predated their marriage by millennia. Her magical awakening hadn't been a natural development. It had been triggered by proximity to Seraphina, designed to activate her binding abilities at the crucial moment. The cottage, the pendant, even our meeting, it was all arranged, she said, her voice barely audible above the crackling of disrupted magical energies. Thomas, blood streaming from wounds caused by the artifact's destruction, nodded slowly. "Everything except one thing, Ellyn. My love for you was never part of the plan. That was real, and it's why I can't complete my mission." The admission hung in the air like a bridge between betrayal and redemption, but before anyone could respond, new sounds echoed through the forest. The howls of approaching wolves, the battle cries of vampire clans, and beneath it all, the steady rhythm of marching feet that spoke of a much larger force converging on their location. The hunters outside were retreating, their mission compromised by the destruction of their binding artifacts. But their withdrawal revealed a more fundamental problem. The magical explosion had sent a beacon across the supernatural world, announcing the location of both a guardian and an alpha vampire to every interested party within 100 miles. "We have perhaps 10 minutes before this clearing becomes a battlefield," Cassius reported grimly. "Multiple supernatural factions are converging on this position, and most of them will shoot first and ask questions later." Ellyn looked around at the faces surrounding her, vampire allies who had trusted her, a young villager who had shown incredible courage, and a husband whose love had been tangled with duty until neither could be separated from the other. The cottage that had been her sanctuary was now the center of a conflict that could spread across the entire region. But in the midst of her confusion and betrayal, one thing became clear. She was no longer the passive victim of others' schemes. Her magical abilities might have been awakened by design, but how she chose to use them remained her decision alone. "Then we have 10 minutes to change the rules of this game," she said, her voice carrying new resolve. "And I know exactly how to do it." The phoenix feather talisman at her throat pulsed with renewed fire, and for the first time since Thomas's arrival, she began to smile. Ellyn moved with newfound purpose toward her workroom, where the ancient grimoire lay open to pages that seemed to write themselves as her understanding deepened. The phoenix feather talisman at her throat pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. But now she could sense something else responding to her presence. A new artifact awakening in the depths of the cottage's foundation. "What are you planning?" Thomas asked, genuine concern replacing the cold duty that had marked his earlier words. Blood still seeped from the wounds caused by the Shadowheart dagger's destruction, and she could see him struggling between his guardian programming and the love that had defined their marriage. "I'm going to do what you guardians have never understood," Ellyn replied, her fingers tracing symbols that appeared on the grimoire's pages in response to her touch. "Instead of maintaining balance through control and containment, I'm going to create it through choice and cooperation." The sounds from the forest were growing closer. Howls, battle cries, and the steady thunder of many feet moving through the undergrowth. Through the cottage windows, they could see torches and strange lights moving between the trees as multiple supernatural factions converged on their location. Cassius's moonstone ring blazed with frantic communications. "Northern vampire clans approaching from the mountain pass," he reported tersely. "But also werewolf packs from the eastern valleys. And something else. Older creatures. Things that predate both our kinds. The magical explosion has drawn every supernatural entity within 50 miles. "How long do we have?" Seraphina asked, though she was clearly gathering her strength for whatever was coming. 5 minutes, perhaps less, Lydia answered from her position at the window. "And it appears they're not all coming to help. Some of these factions have old grudges against each other. This could become a 3-way war with us in the middle." Henrik hefted his blacksmith's hammer, his young face set with determination that reminded Ellyn of his grandfather. "What do you need us to do?" Instead of answering immediately, Ellyn knelt beside the spot where Henrik had driven the dwarven iron rod into the foundation. The rod's destruction had left a hole that penetrated deep into the earth, revealing something that had been hidden beneath the cottage for decades. Reaching into the opening, she withdrew an object that made everyone in the room draw back in awe. The Starfall crown was unlike anything any of them had ever seen. Forged from what appeared to be crystallized starlight and set with gems that held the swirling depths of nebulae, it was clearly an artifact of immense power. But as Ellyn lifted it, they could all sense the terrible price it demanded. Whoever wore the crown would have access to cosmic forces, but at the cost of their mortal limitations. "Where did that come from?" Thomas whispered, his guardian knowledge allowing him to recognize the artifact's significance, even if he couldn't identify its origins. "My ancestors didn't just build a cottage here," Ellyn explained, her voice carrying harmonics that seemed to echo from the crown itself. "They built a sanctuary that could serve as a focal point for the deepest magics. The crown was meant to be worn only in the most desperate circumstances, when the choice was between individual sacrifice and widespread catastrophe. Seraphina's immortal senses could perceive the crown's true nature. That's not just a magical artifact. It's a conduit to the fundamental forces that govern the balance between life and death, order and chaos. Wearing it would give you the power to reshape reality itself. But the energy required would consume me," Ellyn finished calmly. "Yes, I understand the cost. But look around us. In 3 minutes, This clearing will become a battlefield where centuries-old hatreds play out in violence and bloodshed. How many innocents will die if we can't find another way? Through the windows, they could see the first arrivals reaching the edge of the clearing. A pack of werewolves emerged from the eastern tree line, their eyes glowing yellow in the darkness as they scented the air for threats. From the north came vampires moving with inhuman grace, their pale forms seeming to glide over the snow-covered ground. And from the south, something else, entirely. Creatures that appeared to be made of living shadow, with eyes like burning coals. The Umbrals, Thomas identified, his voice tight with ancient fear. Shadow dwellers from the deepest forests. They're drawn by the scent of powerful magic, but they serve no master and follow no laws except their own hunger for magical energy. The three factions had noticed each other now, and the air in the clearing began to crackle with supernatural tension. The werewolves were forming a defensive line, their growls carrying across the distance. The vampires had spread out in a tactical formation that suggested military training. The Umbrals simply watched, their burning eyes fixed on the cottage, where the greatest concentration of magical energy pulsed like a beacon. "They're not going to negotiate," Cassius observed grimly. "Each group sees the others as threats to their own objectives. Combat is inevitable." "Not if I give them a better option," Ellyn said, lifting the starfall crown toward her head. Thomas moved suddenly, his guardian reflexes overriding his emotional conflict. He caught her wrists, preventing her from donning the artifact. "Ellyn, please, you don't understand what you're proposing. The crown doesn't just grant power. It transforms the wearer into something beyond mortal comprehension. You would cease to be human." "And what's the alternative?" she demanded, meeting his eyes with steady resolve. "Let them tear each other apart. Let the violence spread to innocent villages. Let fear and hatred triumph over the possibility of cooperation." Henrik stepped forward, his voice carrying the practical wisdom of his craft. "In the forge, sometimes you have to heat the metal past its breaking point to reshape it properly. But you also need to know when to quench it, to lock in the new form before it destroys itself." His words sparked an idea that seemed to come from both her own intuition and the crown's subtle influence on her thoughts. What if the transformation doesn't have to be permanent? What if there's a way to channel the crown's power temporarily, just long enough to create a new framework for coexistence? Serafina leaned forward, her centuries of experience with magical artifacts lending weight to her words. The crown responds to intent and will. If your goal is truly to create balance rather than to dominate, it might be possible to limit the transformation. But the risk is worth taking, Ellyn finished, because the alternative is unacceptable. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, vampire allies who had trusted her with their alpha's life, a young human who had shown incredible courage, and a husband whose love had been compromised by duty but never extinguished. Each of them had made choices that brought them to this moment, and now she would make hers. "I need you to understand something," she said, her voice carrying new authority as she prepared to don the crown. "If this works, if I can establish a new framework for supernatural coexistence, it won't be maintained by force or fear. It will require ongoing commitment from all parties, vampire, human, and everything in between. Are you prepared to help build that kind of future?" "The northern clans have sought such a future for decades," Serafina replied immediately. "You have our commitment." "The village has already chosen to stand with you," Henrik added. "That won't change now." Thomas was silent for a long moment, his guardian conditioning warring with the love that had defined the best parts of their marriage. Finally, he nodded slowly, Perhaps it's time for the Guardians to learn a new way of maintaining balance. You have my support, whatever comes. Outside, the first shots were being fired, literally in some cases, as the werewolves had apparently acquired modern weapons to supplement their natural abilities. Supernatural energies began crackling between the factions as each group prepared for battle. Now or never, Cassius warned. Once the violence begins in earnest, it will be much harder to stop. Ellyn took a deep breath and placed the starfall crown on her head. The effect was immediate and overwhelming. Power beyond mortal comprehension flooded through her consciousness, bringing with it awareness of cosmic forces that governed the fundamental structure of reality. For a moment, she feared she would be consumed entirely, her individual identity lost in the vast tapestry of universal energies. But the phoenix feather talisman at her throat blazed with protective fire, anchoring her humanity even as divine power transformed her perceptions. She could see the true nature of every creature in the clearing, their fears, their hopes, their capacity for both violence and cooperation. More importantly, she could see the threads of possibility that connected them all, the potential futures that branched out from this critical moment. "I can see it," she whispered, her voice now carrying harmonics that spoke directly to the souls of those who heard it. The path to a better world. But it requires something none of us expected. As she rose from her chair, transformed by cosmic power but still recognizably herself, the cottage began to glow with light that could be seen from miles away. The supernatural factions in the clearing paused their preparations for battle, drawn by the unprecedented display of magical force. The final confrontation was about to begin, but it would not be the battle any of them had anticipated. The moment Ellyn stepped from the cottage, transformed by the Starfall Crown's power, the supernatural warfare grinding to a halt. The werewolves' growls died in their throats, the vampires' tactical formations wavered, and even the enigmatic umbrals turned their burning gazes toward her with something approaching reverence. She could feel their emotions as clearly as physical sensations, the werewolves' territorial fear, the vampires' protective loyalty to their clans, the umbrals' endless hunger for magical sustenance. But beneath these surface drives, she sensed something else. A deep, shared weariness with centuries of conflict and isolation. In her hands, she manifested a new artifact born from the crown's cosmic energies, the Soulfire Brazier, a mystical flame that burned without fuel and revealed truth without mercy. The brazier's light fell upon every creature in the clearing, stripping away pretense and deception to expose the fundamental motivations driving their actions. "Look around you," Ellyn said, her voice carrying across the clearing with supernatural clarity. "What do you see when you strip away the fear and hatred? What do you really want from this confrontation?" The lead werewolf, a massive creature whose human intelligence showed clearly in his amber eyes, stepped forward from his pack. Under the brazier's influence, his voice carried truth that could not be feigned. "We want our children to run free in the forests without fear of hunters. We want the old territories where our ancestors roamed in peace." A vampire lieutenant from the northern clans moved next, her pale features illuminated by the mystical flame. "We seek acceptance, an end to the persecution that forces us to hide in shadows and feed on the desperate rather than finding willing partners for mutual benefit." One of the umbrals drifted closer, its form solidifying slightly in the brazier's light to reveal features that might once have been human. "We hunger not from choice but from necessity. Magic sustains us, but we are denied access to the great workings that once fed our kind freely." Thomas emerged from the cottage, his guardian nature making him visible to all present in his true form, not the simple village husband he had pretended to be, but an immortal being whose responsibility had been to maintain balance through isolation and conflict. I was taught that separation was safety, that different supernatural races could not coexist without destroying each other. But standing here, seeing what my policies have wrought. The soulfire brazier's flames intensified, and suddenly everyone in the clearing could see what Ellyn saw, the threads of connection that bound all supernatural creatures together, the shared origins that predated the artificial divisions that had grown up between them. The werewolf's connection to the natural world, the vampire's bridge between life and death, the umbral's understanding of magic's deeper mysteries, all were facets of a greater whole that had been deliberately fragmented. The ancient war that divided you wasn't fought over territory or resources, Ellyn revealed, the crown's knowledge flowing through her words. It was engineered by forces that profit from your separation. Human religious fanatics who gain power by defining themselves against supernatural others. Corporate interests that exploit supernatural territories when their inhabitants are too busy fighting each other to organize resistance. Political entities that use fear of the supernatural to justify authoritarian policies. Seraphina appeared beside Thomas, her vampire strength restored by proximity to the cosmic energies emanating from the crown. You're saying we've been manipulated into fighting a war that serves our enemy's purposes? I'm saying the manipulation continues because we allow it to continue, Ellyn replied. But what if there were another way? What if instead of fighting over scraps of territory and hiding from human persecution, you worked together to create something new? The soulfire brazier's flames began to shift, showing not just truth, but possibility. Visions of futures where werewolves served as environmental guardians in partnership with human conservationists, where vampires used their immortal perspectives to guide human institutions away from short-term thinking, where umbrals helped regulate magical practices to prevent the kind of catastrophic accidents that created supernatural dead zones. These visions, the werewolf leader growled, his voice filled with wonder. They show cooperation, not domination. Mutual benefit rather than zero-sum competition. But such cooperation would require trust, the vampire lieutenant pointed out. And trust requires vulnerability. How do we know this isn't another form of manipulation, designed to make us lower our defenses? Ellyn smiled. And for a moment, the cosmic power radiating from the crown was overshadowed by simple human warmth. Because I'm about to do something that proves my commitment to this new path. Something that will cost me everything I've gained, but might give all of you something you've never had. She raised her hands, and the starfall crown began to glow with light that seemed to come from the heart of distant galaxies. But instead of directing that power outward as a weapon, she began to weave it into something unprecedented, a binding not of containment, but of cooperation, a magical framework that would allow different supernatural races to work together without losing their essential natures. "This is insane," Henrik whispered from the cottage doorway. "That much power. It'll burn through you like lightning through a metal rod." "Perhaps," Ellyn agreed. "But if it works, if we can establish a foundation for lasting cooperation instead of eternal conflict, isn't that worth any personal cost?" The ritual she was beginning would require not just her own sacrifice, but conscious choice from every supernatural faction present. They would have to willingly bind themselves to principles of cooperation and mutual aid, accepting limitations on their actions in exchange for the benefits of alliance. The real question was whether centuries of mistrust could be overcome by a single moment of shared truth. The binding ritual that Ellyn wove through the Starfall Crown's power required more than magical energy. It demanded a genuine commitment from each supernatural faction willing to participate. As cosmic forces swirled around her, she felt the terrible price of wielding such power. The crown was burning through her mortal limitations, transforming her into something that could barely be called human. But in her hands, a new artifact began to manifest. The Unity Prism, a crystalline structure that could channel and focus the disparate magical energies of different supernatural races. Unlike the weapons and tools of containment that had defined supernatural politics for centuries, the prism was designed to amplify cooperation rather than enforce submission. "Each of you must choose freely," Ellyn said, her voice echoing with harmonics that seemed to come from the spaces between stars. "I cannot compel this alliance. The binding only works if every participant enters it willingly, understanding both the benefits and the responsibilities it entails." The werewolf leader stepped forward first, his massive form silhouetted against the Unity Prism's growing radiance. "My pack has grown tired of running from hunters who cannot distinguish between mindless beasts and intelligent beings. If cooperation offers our children a chance at peaceful lives, then we choose alliance." He placed his hand on the prism, and immediately the crystal began to pulse with the rhythms of the natural world. Heartbeats, seasonal cycles, the deep patience of growing things. The werewolves' connection to the Earth's vital forces flowed into the binding, offering strength and endurance to any alliance they joined. The vampire lieutenant moved next, her pale features set with determination, born from centuries of isolation. The northern clans have long sought bridges to the mortal world. We offer our knowledge of time's passage, our ability to see beyond the immediate concerns that drive short-term thinking. As she touched the prism, new harmonics joined the werewolves' earthy rhythms, the slow music of immortal patience, the wisdom that came from watching civilizations rise and fall. The vampire's perspective added depth to the magical framework, creating space for long-term planning and historical understanding. The umbral that approached the prism moved with the fluid grace of living shadow, its form solidifying just enough to make contact with the crystal. We hunger, yes, but not from malice. We offer our understanding of magic's deeper currents, our ability to navigate the spaces between worlds where others cannot go. The prism suddenly blazed with dark fire as the umbral's otherworldly knowledge integrated with the existing alliance. Their contribution was different from the others, not raw power or wisdom, but understanding of the hidden connections that linked all magical phenomena. They would serve as guides through supernatural territories too dangerous for others to explore. Thomas stood at the cottage door, his guardian nature warring with everything he had been taught about maintaining supernatural balance through separation and control. The Unity Prism's light fell upon him, revealing the truth that the Soulfire brazier had shown to the others. His role as an enforcer of artificial divisions had caused more harm than the conflicts he had been meant to prevent. "The Guardians have maintained balance through fear for too long," he admitted, moving slowly toward the prism. "Perhaps it's time we learned to maintain it through cooperation instead." His touch added something unexpected to the magical framework, not the cold duty that had defined his recent actions, but the protective love that had motivated him to build a sanctuary for the woman he cherished. The Guardian contribution to the Alliance would be exactly what their name suggested: protection for those who chose cooperation over conflict. Seraphina, her strength fully restored by proximity to the cosmic energies, approached last. "The northern clans accept this alliance, not just for ourselves, but as representatives of vampire communities across the continent. We pledge our resources, our networks, and our commitment to proving that cooperation between supernatural races is not only possible, but beneficial to all involved. As the alpha vampire placed her hand on the unity prism, the crystal structure suddenly expanded, its faceted surface reflecting not just the magical energies of those present, but the potential for connections that stretched across continents. The binding she completed would serve as a template for similar alliances wherever supernatural communities chose to work together rather than in isolation. But the ritual's completion came at a cost that Ellyn had anticipated but hoped to avoid. The Starfall Crown's power, channeled through her mortal form for too long, began to consume her essential self. She could feel her individual identity being absorbed into the cosmic forces she had summoned, her human thoughts and emotions dissolving into universal awareness. "The price," she whispered, her voice already growing distant. "I knew there would be a price." Thomas moved with desperate speed, reaching for the unity prism even as Ellyn's form began to fade. "There has to be another way. The alliance is established. You don't need to sacrifice yourself to maintain it." But it was Henrik who provided the solution, his blacksmith's understanding of metallurgy translating into insight about magical energies. In the forge, you can sometimes save overheated metal by quenching it in the right medium at the right moment. What if we can ground the excess power before it consumes her completely? Working together with an instinctive coordination that spoke well for their new alliance, the supernatural beings in the clearing began channeling power back into the unity prism, using its crystalline structure to absorb the cosmic energies that threatened to burn through Ellyn's mortality. The werewolves provided earth connection, the vampires offered their immortal endurance, the umbrals contributed their knowledge of magical currents, and Thomas added his guardian training in energy manipulation. Slowly, carefully, they pulled Ellyn back from the edge of dissolution, grounding the Starfall Crown's power in the collective strength of their alliance rather than in her individual sacrifice. When the light finally faded, Ellyn collapsed to her knees in the snow, mortal once again, but forever changed by her brief contact with cosmic forces. The unity prism remained, a permanent artifact that would serve as both symbol and practical tool for supernatural cooperation. The alliance was forged, not through conquest or manipulation, but through choice, sacrifice, and the courage to trust former enemies with vulnerable hope. 3 months after the night that changed everything, Ellyn stood in her garden, watching the most unusual community meeting in the village's history unfold in her cottage's main room. Through the window, she could see Henrik discussing crop rotation techniques with a werewolf agriculturalist, while Serafina reviewed historical land records with the village mayor. The sight should have seemed impossible, yet it felt as natural as sunrise. The cottage itself had been transformed by the events of that winter night. The protective wards still hummed in the walls, but their purpose had shifted from defense to welcome. Where once the magical energies had been focused on keeping threats at bay, they now served to create a space where supernatural and human communities could meet on equal ground. In her workroom, the ancient grimoire had filled itself with new knowledge, not just the accumulated wisdom of her ancestors, but fresh insights contributed by each member of the growing alliance. Vampire historical perspectives, werewolf environmental lore, umbral magical theory, and guardian protective techniques all mingled on pages that seemed to expand to accommodate every new discovery. The unity prism sat on her mantelpiece, its crystalline facets catching and reflecting the afternoon sunlight in patterns that spoke of connections spanning the continent. Similar prisms had been created in other locations, each one serving as both communication device and anchor point for local supernatural alliances. The network that had begun in her small cottage now reached from the northern mountains to the southern ports. The Eastern Territories are requesting guidance on establishing trade relationships with local vampire clans, Serafina reported, emerging from the meeting with a satisfied expression. Apparently, immortal perspectives on long-term economic planning are proving quite valuable to human merchant guilds. Ellyn smiled, though she could still feel the lingering effects of her brief transformation. The Starfall crown had been safely stored beneath the cottage's foundation, but traces of cosmic awareness remained in her perception. She could sense the health of the magical networks that now connected dozens of communities, could feel when conflicts arose and when new alliances formed. "Any serious problems?" she asked. "Nothing that can't be resolved through negotiation," Serafina replied. "The werewolf territorial disputes in the Western Valleys are being mediated by a vampire diplomat who has experience with boundary negotiations. The umbral community near the old ruins has agreed to help human mages understand the deeper magical currents in exchange for access to carefully regulated power sources." Thomas appeared in the garden gateway, carrying a leather satchel filled with letters from guardian communities across the continent. His role had evolved dramatically since that night, from enforcer of supernatural separation to coordinator of protective services for the growing Alliance network. The transformation had not been easy for him, but Ellyn could see the relief in his eyes at being able to use his abilities for building rather than constraining. "The Guardian Council has formally recognized the new Alliance structure," he announced, setting the satchel on the garden table. "It took months of debate, but they've finally accepted that cooperation creates more stable balance than forced separation ever did." Henrik approached from the village path, his blacksmith's apron traded for the more formal clothing, appropriate to his new role as human liaison to the supernatural communities. His courage during the crisis had earned him respect from both human and non-human residents of the region, and his practical approach to problem-solving had proven invaluable in negotiating the countless small details that made large-scale cooperation possible. "The Autumn Harvest Festival is going to be interesting this year," he reported with a grin. "The werewolf packs want to contribute traditional hunt celebrations, the vampires are offering historical reenactments, and the umbrals have proposed a magical light display that apparently involves reshaping shadows into artistic forms." Ellyn laughed, the sound carrying across the garden and drawing approving smiles from the mixed group gathered in her cottage. "A year ago, I thought my biggest concern was whether old Martha's arthritis would act up before the winter rains. Now I'm helping coordinate festivals between species that barely acknowledged each other's existence. But the changes had come with challenges as well. Not every supernatural community had chosen to join the Alliance network, and there were still those, both human and otherwise, who profited from the old systems of fear and separation. The cottage received reports of hunters who refused to accept the new reality, of vampire clans that preferred isolation to cooperation, of human communities that saw any supernatural presence as a threat to be eliminated. "The work isn't finished," Thomas observed, reading her expression accurately. "It may never be finished. Balance requires constant attention, whether it's maintained through separation or cooperation." "But now we have tools we didn't have before," Ellyn replied, touching the small pouch where she carried her grandmother's silver pendant. The artifact had become a symbol of the bridge between old wisdom and new possibilities, linking traditional healing knowledge with innovative approaches to supernatural cooperation. And we have allies who understand that building something new is harder than tearing down something old. As if summoned by her words, a new presence made itself known in the garden, a seedling that had not been there moments before, growing with supernatural speed from soil that had been bare. The plant's leaves shimmered with an inner light, and its roots seemed to extend far deeper than its size would suggest. "The eternal garden seed," Seraphina breathed, recognizing the artifact immediately. Legend says it appears only in places where genuine transformation has taken root, where the ground itself has been changed by acts of courage and sacrifice. The seedling continued to grow as they watched, its branches reaching toward the cottage and the village beyond. As it grew, Ellyn could sense its purpose, not just as a symbol of the changes they had wrought, but as a practical tool for nurturing the delicate alliances they had built. The garden that would grow from this seed would be a sanctuary where any being could find safety and healing, regardless of their nature or origin. "A place where different worlds can coexist," Ellyn murmured, understanding flooding through her as the seed's roots connected with the cottage's ley line network. Not by hiding from each other, but by choosing to build something together that none of us could create alone. The afternoon sun slanted through the branches of the growing tree, casting shadows that seemed to dance with possibility. In her cottage, the mixed voices of human and supernatural representatives continued their work, planning festivals and trade routes and educational exchanges that would have been unthinkable just months before. Ellyn had begun this journey as a lonely healer, tending to forgotten villagers in a cottage hidden deep in ancient woods. Now she stood at the center of a network that connected communities across the continent, her small sanctuary having become the seed from which a new kind of world could grow. The loneliness that had once sat beside her at the dinner table had been replaced by something far richer, the knowledge that every choice to trust, every decision to hope, every act of courage in the face of fear contributed to a future where healing was possible for wounds that had festered for centuries. As the eternal garden continued to grow around her, Ellyn smiled and went inside to help plan tomorrow's challenges, ready to tend whatever seeds of possibility the future might bring.